everybody. So my name is Wes, and today I'm going to be talking about X, the ancient Japanese art of Y, the mobilization of Japanese metalinguistic fantasies in self-help literature. So let me explain why I will be talking about this. This presentation is going to be a bit different from what I normally do in that I'm actually just going to give a background on kind of what made me start this study, because it started off with a different motivation than it ended up. I didn't think I'd be talking about what I ended up talking about. But I'm going to go through my data with you then, and then I'm going to end by actually theorizing a concept that I call linguistic fantasy, and hopefully you will all agree that it's real. But I'm still thinking through my thinking here, but hopefully, this makes sense as it is in its current phases. But basically, the beginning of this study, the reason that I started out doing this, is that I've been doing a lot of work on language ideologies. As Silverstein notes in his seminal piece on this topic, these are sets of beliefs about language articulated by the users as a rationalization or justification of perceived language structure and use. In simpler terms, these are beliefs about who uses or doesn't use or shouldn't use language and why. Now, these have seen a lot of study, but primarily, and understandably, they've been focused on native speaker belief systems. Indeed, as Silverstein writes in this paper, you can see he's talking about reference to native speaker awareness, or in terms of native participants in a society. And even Croskerty, who's another major thinker in this area, talks about people who are involved in linguistics and social systems. So I started to think, okay, what about people, though, that aren't native speakers or aren't even involved? Because there has been a little bit of research on non-native speakers' ideologies about a language, such as in the educational space, as in this recent book here by Takeuchi. And similarly, in Croskerty's piece here, you can see that he lists three different types of language ideologies. You have indigenous language ideologies, which are the native speakers, of course. But you also then have contact-related language ideologies, when two groups meet and start exchanging things. And then the third being imposed language ideologies. And these ones kind of are what I was interested in, as they aren't involved in people that are using the language, but they're applied kind of top-down by powerful groups and elites to represent people as violent, corrupt, immoral, etc. But is this all there is, was kind of my question. Can't you have a language ideology about a culture that you don't have any power of that's also possible? As simple as something like saying, French is a beautiful language. French is a romantic language. That's a language ideology that people often hold, despite never going to France, never studying French, etc. And you might think, well, sure, but what do these ideologies held by people that don't engage with the language matter? Well, this question has actually been answered quite a lot in cultural studies literature. For instance, in the Japanese context, all of these books spend a lot of time talking about the reception of Japanese stuff by non-Japanese people and how that influences Japan and Japaneseness. For instance, in Shots in the Dark, which is about Zen, you can see he uses a metaphor of a funhouse mirror, being the idea that sometimes our reflection is distorted in a way that we can just laugh off, but sometimes we're like, oh, I look better in the mirror. And so they note that it is on this boundary line that we can see how the Japanese have created Japanese culture while actively selecting their self-image from among the various images of Japan that have come from foreign countries. Likewise, in Inventing the Way of the Samurai, which is about the concept of Bushido and how it was developed kind of ad hoc after samurai were no longer a thing, they note that positive appraisals of Bushido outside of Japan helped influence its popularity as a concept in Japan, noting that Bushido discourse in other countries was given considerable coverage reflecting national pride. Similarly, Befu, in the book Hegemony of Homogeneity, which is really hard to say, they note that Nihonjin no discourse, or Japanese discourse about Japaneseness, requires acceptance by outsiders to function, noting how the chrysanthemum and the sword was very, very well received in Japan in translation because it played into what he calls the newfound auto-Orientalism of the Japanese context, being validated by these observers. So I started to think this could be the same for language too. What about people discussing language that aren't part of the culture, don't even necessarily interact with the culture, or are aimed at these kind of people? So I wanted to explore the creation, shape, and use of language ideologies about Japanese which were promoted by non-native users of the language, aimed at non-native users or even non-users of the language, and not examples of imposed by a nation state, so they could potentially be positive. But beyond just saying like, hey, I found them, I also wanted to be, what's the purpose of these? Why do these ideologies exist, and what is the function of them? What are they being used to do? And I think I stumbled across the concept that hasn't been named, and again, I hope you will agree. So to do this, I chose for my data 8 books here that are written by non-native Japanese speakers. Some of them have Japanese background, some have spent time in Japan and are quite good at Japanese, but they're all non-native speakers and they're aimed at non-native or even non-speakers of Japanese. And this is part of a boom of self-help literature focused around a Japanese word, right? the titles are all a Japanese word, except for Japanisme, which is Japanese words, right, in the plural. So I copied the text of each book, which described Japanese vocabulary, and I used emergent coding through NVivo to note how the words were approached, and how definitions were approached, and how this discussion of language in these books was used as part of their overall goals. I should note here, though, that I skipped uses of Japanese vocabulary which were not discussing words. So if they said something like, that's how I found my ikigai, or kintsugi is fun, I didn't code that. That's not part of my data. I wanted specific definitions and discussion of language. So with that, I'm going to go through my findings, and we're going to kind of build up and up and up, and hopefully, again, get to a similar conclusion. So first and foremost, Japanese words are written with italics almost whenever possible. Out of the almost 1,100 words that appeared, 893 are in italics, and this number should be larger because out of the 196 that are not in italics, 122 come from the book Ikigai-kan, and this book has really bad editing. It's very, very sloppy. So as you can see here, for instance, Ikigai switches between italics and non-italics. Yokyu is in italics, but then yoku and kyu and motomeru are not. Kodokushi starts in italics and then goes to non-italics, but then kodoku comes into italics. So I believe the intent here is to have even more italics. Now, in and of itself, of course, writing a Japanese word in italics is meaningless. We've all written papers. I've written Japanese words in italics. But as you'll see, I think this is important because it contributes to a sense of markedness of the Japanese language that goes throughout these books. And you can see it by even what words they put in italics. For instance, sakura, ikebana, haiku, and wabi-sabi. We can debate. Some of these words, I would say, are very established in English and do not need italics whatsoever. Similarly, natto, mochi, anko, yukata, ryokan, onsen. Again, I'm sure we'd have differences, but a lot of these I would not write in italics. Minimally, while kisaten is a word that I would put in italics, ramen is not a word that I would put in italics whatsoever. But this is not ramen, right? This is italics ramen. It's a Japanese word, so it's not the word you know. And I think that's very important because that links also to the translation strategies. When Japanese terms are translated in these books, vast percentage of the time, it is Japanese first, then English, rather than English first, then Japanese. And again, on its own, this is nothing. But as we'll see, it's part of a larger discussion because there are things like the walking meditation of Zen Buddhism, known as kinhin, right, where the translation is given and then the word, is much less common than something like sakura, when cherry trees bloom in the spring and produce an explosion of white flowers to flood every heart. And I believe this is, as we'll see, part of presenting the Japanese word and then giving an explanation because you can't explain it and then say like the flat like cherry blossoms are called sakura. That doesn't allow the markedness, whereas putting sakura first and then explaining it like this kind of does. Additionally, words are not just words. So the way when they say like this word is or this thing is, the word, term, or phrase appears quite a bit, but describing them as practices, activities, or pursuits is also common. But the second most common is describing them as a term I broadly say as belief systems, aesthetics, beliefs, concepts, philosophies, principles, and values, as well as feelings and experiences. So, for instance, while you will see people saying like there is one phrase that I'd like you to remember, there's also things like ikebana is the art of flower arranging. Now, I don't disagree. I think ikebana is an art, but I'm just saying what the data is. Or like the Japanese cultural practice of Nikon, right? Nikon isn't a word, it's a practice. For belief system, you see things like a concept known as harahachibu, or a philosophy of wabi-sabi. It's not a word, it's a philosophy, right? The ideals of Japanese cultural values, like omoriari is an ideal, it's a principle, this kind of presentation. And then while rare, you'll see things like wabi being described as a feeling, or wabi-sabi being an experience, something that you engage with in that way. Additionally then, you see books like Japanisme, which start by saying that all the things in the book are philosophies. This is this intro to the book. The book is full of philosophies. What kind of philosophies are in the book? Well, things like matcha is prepared in two ways, or Japanese have teirai and ugai, right? These are not called philosophies directly, but the book frames itself as full of philosophies, not full of words, right? And then also, it's very common in these books to note that translation is impossible or insufficient. This is a position that runs throughout all of the text. You can see it in just calling things untranslatable, as in these two examples here. But there's also, for instance, kind of subtle ones where they'll say that kind of as a catch gap. No, they don't. It's not that they can't translate it because it's uncommon, they don't use it. They can't translate it because they know that it's impossible to even try. Putting it into words cannot happen, right? It is, putting it into words will limit your attempt to engage with them, is the actual framing here. In other cases, it's just hedging, right? Western philosophers and psychologists may refer to this. It's not great, may, right? Or might be translated as. Or this one-word translation doesn't capture the essence of shokunin, right? This kind of hedging of translation, like it's okay, but it's not going to get you the full meaning, is something that is present throughout these texts as they talk about Japanese. Additionally, then, something that surprised me is that these words are often active entities. They aren't just things that you can do or experience, they do things. Like wabi-sabi shows us the beauty of a fleeting, changeable, and imperfect nature of the world around us. Kodawari guides and encourages your attention to detail. A kokorozashi can guide you and provide you. So these words are doing words now, right? These concepts are active. And then there's a threefold set of discussions here that present the words as particular and unique to Japan and its culture, old, but also full of meaning. And this links to the untranslatability thing, but also extremely commonplace. So, for instance, kokoro has been alive before there was a system to write it down. As far as I'm aware, this is true, but again, framing it as ancient, right? Ikebana and kokedama linked to Japan's ancient Shinto religion, continuing to make its presence felt, right? It has that religious ancient link. Heart, mind, and soul are linked in kokoro, right? It's full of meaning. Yet at the same time, wabi-sabi is the aesthetic pillar of the Japanese people, right? It's everywhere, is the framing. One of the most common sayings in Japan is harahachibu, which is repeated before or after eating. Now, I think they are mixing this up with itadakimasu and gojiso sama deshita, but it doesn't matter if it's true or not. It matters how the framing is, right? Harahachibu is extremely common. Ikigai is used casually in conversation, so you need to approach ikigai casually, as the Japanese do. Or sometimes, again, the hedging of the reason you don't hear it is not because it's not common, it's subconscious to the extent that it's essentially forgotten. Japanese people know about it so much that they don't even think about it, they don't even talk about it. It's just always there deep inside their minds, right? That's kind of the framing of these vocabulary. And then also, there's a link, importantly, that all these books spend a lot of time talking about etymologies. They devote a lot of time to it. And what we might call etymologies, to use a term I found recently in other research. These are often incorrect. The most incredibly incorrect one comes from Shinryoku, which opens with the wrong kanji for the word on the top of the book. But again, it doesn't matter if it's true. But you can see, for instance, ones like this. This is a very, very detailed etymology, and you can see how it's linked to this etymology proving things about the Japanese people by saying that kokorozashi has samurai on top, or warrior, and then spirit. So the heart of the samurai. So this is linked to the moral code of the samurai, and therefore, even in Japanese modern society, you have that samurai spirit. Now, there are a lot of problems with this. One being that this is not a Japanese-made character. This was made by Chinese people. That's problem one. Problem two is that while that looks like samurai now, it comes from to go. So the actual metaphor of kokorozashi, which means like an aim, is that it's where your heart goes to, right? That's what the actual metaphor of the kanji is. But again, none of it matters if it's true or not. That's not the point. This is fantasy, right? So this etymology is used in discourse about the Japanese people as if it's proof of something. And then also, unsurprisingly, there's a common framing of unlike the West throughout, right? So more and more elusive to Westerners. These Japanese concepts are things that Westerners don't understand anymore. Japanese have a phrase, shinshin ichino, which body and mind is one, rather than seeing body and mind as two separate entities as we do in the West. And this word is proof that Japanese people see it differently, right? The word exists, therefore it's proof. Ikigai is greatly misunderstood outside of Japan. The majority of your ikigai knowledge is Western misconceptions, but the Japanese is different, right? And then you probably already guessed this, but as you've seen in the data, there's a constant assertion of a singular Japanese populace. And I don't mean singular even in racial terms. I mean in terms of there is like no diversity of thought within Japan. From Hokkaido down to the bottom of Okinawa, the Ryukyu Islands, everyone in Japan has the same thing. The Japanese read tsundoku to describe acquiring books. Probably true to some extent, right? But it's an example of framing like Japanese people reject compliments, full stop. Right? All Japanese people reject compliments. It is a cultural trait ingrained in their psyche from a very young age. They never speak of themselves as striving or to be the best. Instead, they talk about doing their best. Japanese ideas about tamashi as in a singular Japanese idea, right? Kokoro as understood in Japanese culture as a singular kind of entity. Or a singular psychology of the Japanese people, which exists and underpins everything about Japan, right? A label was needed for what people have always known, that singular Japanese populace. So what's the point of all this, right? We can say, hey, look, it's Orientalist, and it is. We can say, hey, look, it's Nihonjinron, and it is. But so what? Well, here's where I attempt to say, so what? Which is talking about linguistic fantasy. So work in progress, thoughts are under construction, but here's my attempt to define it. Linguistic fantasy is a type of metalinguistic discussion wherein language forms are positioned as active, unique, or mysterious, in other words, special, marked, and yet commonplace throughout a population, and then used to support claims about the overarching society and the culture of the language users. The veracity of the claims is not relevant. They can be true, they can be false. It doesn't matter. They can be used to support true claims as well. But this linguistic fantasy is supported by a language ideology, which in turn it fosters, which is sort of an extreme yet inverted version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So Sapir-Whorf, of course, they believe that the language use we use influences how we think. Here, the way we think is evident in our language use instead. The words that we use evidence who we are as selectively chosen, right? And so the very existence of a word like wabi-sabi, the etymology, as in kokorozashi, comes from samurai heart, or an alleged linguistic behavior like not accepting compliments in a language is treated as a valid data point for making broader claims about all native speakers of the language. Now, this can be used for a lot of things, but it does inherently involve a tautology wherein the processes of linguistic fantasy evidence the same images of the group as a unique monoculture that are required for it to function. So I think linguistic fantasy can be used in a lot of ways, and indeed, there are words that aren't Japanese discussed in these books, and one of the authors has even written a book on like some Swedish words. So I don't think this is restricted to Japan, but it does seem to have this tautology of evidencing, air quotes, a monoculture that it needs to exist. And this can be used to kind of torture this fantasy metaphor, world building, where it suits any claim. And the common claim in these books is that the East has some connection to ancient natural being that we have lost in the West and need to regain, and that you need to buy these books in order to understand. To kind of explain this point here, this tautology point, you can see in this first book, they're talking about wabi-sabi as a desire to understand what lies beneath the psychology of Japanese people. A label is needed for what people have already known. So the existence of wabi-sabi is being used to evidence the very monoculture that is necessary to claim that wabi-sabi is relevant to the entirety of the Japanese population, right? It is a tautology. Or here, you can see how wabi-sabi is proving that the Japanese place value as a whole, like all Japanese people, on an irregular or cracked teacup. So it's producing itself. But we can have a little tautology as a treat, right? That's okay. But that is one thing it has to evidence. But to kind of show all this in action, I want to look at this paragraph, which is talking about the word jibun rashi, because you can see everything I've talked about here, but also the linguistic fantasy being used, as the discussion of jibun rashi as a word is used as the primary, if not only, evidence for the eventual claims about Japanese people. So breaking down the word further, you have bun, which means part, portion, or share, right? Which we can understand jibun as your part, your self part. This indicates that yourself is part of something bigger, society. The Japanese understand that their identity is derived from being part of a whole, and they belong to various groups in which they are interdependent with others. These interpersonal relationships allow them to feel that they have a proper place in society. In Japan, self-authenticity goes beyond the individual. Japanese know that one cannot be authentic without the help of others or without being of service to others. All of these assertions are rooted in the discussion of jibun rashi as a word, right? All the proof for everything that they're saying is in jibun rashi. To show you some other key examples, things like, in fact, there is no Japanese word that means retire. Obviously not true, but that's the assertion. And therefore, Japanese people love to work. This book, by the way, seems to mix up Okinawan and Japanese and treats them all as one language, which is another problem that we can't unpack in 20 minutes, but there you go. One of the most difficult things to grasp about Japanese culture is that concepts and answers are often aimai, which means vague. So I want to highlight here, they don't say which means vague. They say which means aimai, which means vague. So they flag the word. The Japanese people have a word for this, therefore, all this stuff I'm saying about ambiguity and group harmony is true. Because there's a word for it. Aimai, right? They wouldn't have a word if it wasn't true. Similarly, the attitudes and ideology behind kintsugi can be brought about by a willingness and flexibility to accept things that cannot be changed. How do we know that Japanese people accept things that can't be changed? Well, they have the word shogunai. There's your proof, right? There's the proof. The proof is in the word. Or even in this very, very simple example, the Japanese word for brown is chairo, which means color of tea. This should give you an indication of how much we love tea. The fact that the Japanese word for gray is rat color does not seem to evidence that Japanese people love rats, right? That is not presented in the data. It's all cherry-picked. But this is a very, very straightforward, simple example. Japanese people love tea. How do we know? They have the word tea color. Proof, right? Proof. So this kind of runs throughout. So ultimately, again, I'm still kind of thinking through my thoughts, but I hope you kind of see where I'm going with this, as I think that it's very easy to find this discourse around Japan. Weird Japan discourse has been a thing for a while, but these books show an example of a metalinguistic practice, linguistic fantasy, wherein the discussion of language itself becomes the basis for assertions of culture, true or false. And there you go. That's my thinking. I hope you enjoyed. But yeah, thank you very much for your time.